Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I am staff writer Cody Goodwin. Glad you're here joining us today alongside staff writer and recruiting expert Brett Greenberg. We're here to discuss a brand new Alabama head football coach. Just literally a day after Rodak and I recorded a podcast that we didn't think we would be recording, which was that Nick Saban was retiring. He has a replacement, Kalen DeBoer, coming over after 2 years at Washington to be Alabama's head football coach. Deal is being finalized, I believe, as we're recording this Friday late afternoonish. He's going to be the guy. There's a lot of different things that we will get into either on this show or in future podcasts. We'll be sure to talk to guys like John Talty, Mike Rodak, may even tap some of the national guys to discuss a little bit more about this. But we wanted to get an instant reaction podcast in your feed now. Alabama's got their guy. Brett, what is maybe your initial reaction before we get into kind of some of the resume stuff and what he brings and recruiting stuff to Kalen DeBoer being Alabama's new head football coach?
Yeah, for starters, it's that was, I was like a little over 48 hours, I think it was. And I know Greg Burns said 72 hours. It just,
dude, not even 48 hours.
I don't know how I don't know how it was for you. I know how it was for Alabama fans on Twitter, but for me, felt like we were on day 8. Again, it's just remarkable. I mean, it's University of Alabama. And I put this on Twitter. Is this the greatest or the biggest head coaching vacancy in sports history? And I know a lot of my followers are Alabama, but there's an argument to be made there. And for Greg Byrne to go out there and get seemingly his guy in under 48 hours or just around the 48-hour mark is remarkable. But yeah, I mean, instant reaction to me, it's, low hanging fruit here, but offense, Pac-12 offense. I know he's coming over, Washington's going over to the Big Ten, but my initial thought is offense. And watching that semifinal game against Texas and seeing Michael Penix Jr. and Roma Duze and all these other guys just kind of air out the ball. I know, the offense didn't look as good as it did the whole season against Michigan, but again, low-hanging fruit there is just offense, and already talking with a couple commits and summer signees who haven't enrolled yet, 2 wide receiver guys. They seem to be very thrilled with that, and some other guys he talked to is just kind of what I said too. It's just offense, and Alabama at the beginning of the Nick Saban area was winning 21-3 or 7-3 or whatever it may be, and then it kind of that big jump he adapted and got that run of quarterbacks and Tua and Jalen and Mac and Bryce Young and Ed Milroe last year, maybe a little bit of a down year, so to speak, offensive wise, but seems like Kalen DeBoer is bringing a whole lot of offensive firepower no matter who is on his roster. So again, offense for me.
Yeah, offensive background was kind of the theme, at least of a lot of the guys that they seemingly targeted, or at least the names that we continually heard, names that, our John Talty heard, our Matt Zenitz heard, throughout the process. And we won't dive too much into what exactly, that process was like. We'll have a few days to maybe flush out a lot more of that information. But a lot of the names that popped up, Kalen DeBoer, obviously, but also Mike Norvell from Florida State. I know that Florida State had a really good defense, but that's a guy with some offensive background. Steve Sarkisian, obviously, he was the offensive coordinator here at one point in time. His name got spun around quite a bit. But then also Dan Lanning, more defensive minded. I think that was maybe one of the first names that popped up that people were like, yeah, bring that guy in. But yeah, when I think of Kalen DeBoer, the first thing I thought of was, okay, like this guy's a winner. He has spent some time in the limelight, I think, this past season, just with everything that went on about the Pac-12. And then you got the fact that like Washington was undefeated Pac-12 champs. They beat Oregon twice. They ultimately, 14-0 all the way to the national championship game before they lost to Michigan. That's maybe where the offense kind of looked a little rough at times. But overall, like that's, what do we know about Kalen DeBoer? Let's maybe we should start there. He's a winner. He is a offensive coordinator by trade. That's how he kind of came up as an assistant. So again, kind of leans to that, offensive idea, or that's kind of the first thought that comes to mind. He got his start at the NAIA level. So this is a guy that has been, lower levels of football, very similar to like a Lance Leipold, for example, at Kansas, kind of started way lower level, non-traditional, GA at like a Power 5 type thing and growing into a head coach. Like this guy started NAIA level, became a head coach there. He's originally from South Dakota. He coached and he actually played ball at Sioux Falls in the NAIA level. So, kind of got his bearings there, and then he made the jump to FCS and FBS, was an offensive coordinator for the better part of a decade before he jumped and became the head coach at Fresno State, went from Fresno State to Washington, and Washington now down here to Alabama. Some stats that I thought were interesting as we were kind of going about the process, kind of learning about these guys. Kalen DeBoer's career head coaching record, 104-12 at 3 different stops. That includes NAIA Sioux Falls, Fresno State, and then Washington. At Washington, the last 2 years where he's been, 25-3. They went 11-2 in 2022 and then 14-1 this past season. In the stretch of there, they won 21 games in a row, 14 this year and the last 7 from last year. Another stat that stuck out, 12-2 against top 25 teams, including 10-1 at Washington. And that includes a 6-1 mark this past year. All of those wins came in November, December, and January. So you think offense, I think winner. Like, this guy knows how to win games. He knows how to win big games. And we can get into a lot more of, what specifically he's ultimately going to bring to Alabama, but very impressive resume. A lot of his damage was done at the NAIA level, but clearly the last 2 years of Washington were impressive enough that, he was not just the only guy, or he wasn't the only name, I guess, that was floating around a lot of different Power 5 jobs that may have come open. But this guy seems to win every single place he goes, which I think is a really impressive, that's something obviously you want when you're looking for a head coach, right?
Yeah. I think when people, maybe look at the resume, they say, okay, well, they coached at this level, he coached here. But to me, I don't know about you, Cody, 104-12 is 112. I don't know how, no matter how you cut it, that it's just remarkable. And, you talked about it right there. His last 2 seasons at Washington, his, record against AP top 25 opponents, I believe 3 of those are versus Dan Lanning. And I believe he's beaten Steve Sarkisian in Texas. I believe he beat him last year in the Alamo Bowl and then beat him in the semifinal this season. So like you said, he's he's winning big games, and he's winning games against coaches that a lot of Alabama fans maybe would have said they would have liked a little more than Kalen DeBoer. But yeah, it's just remarkable kind of his come up. You mentioned Lance Leipold, but it seems like with Kalen DeBoer, it's kind of just risen like straight up. I mean, from, getting at Seahawks Falls 19 years ago. I mean, he was there from 2005 or 2009 was the head coach from 2005 to 2009, and 19 years later, or I'm not great at math, whatever years later, being the head coach at University of Alabama. I mean, it's just remarkable. I like the hire. If you're an Alabama fan, I think you're going to like the hire. And one thing interesting too, I brought up the quarterbacks earlier. I think, with Julian saying on the roster, it's going to be crucial to kind of keep him on campus. I know we can talk about that a little bit later, what players we think are crucial to keep on the roster. But one thing, talking with a couple 247 guys and Brandon Huffin and Greg Biggins, kind of learning how he's kind of quarterback whisperer, so to speak. Jake Haener over at Fresno State was not very good, quite frankly, at Fresno State. Then, he comes in and produces, and he's an NFL draft pick. Then Michael Penix, I know he had the injuries and stuff like that, but he was with Michael Penix over at Indiana, and then he leaves, and then clearly Penix is in the portal, and there's something to be said there for him to go to Washington. I know he was I think he was one of the highest ranked quarterbacks in the portal at the time, so that's something to be said about that. He wanted to go back and play for his offense coordinator and Kalen DeBoer, and we've seen we saw the year Michael Penix had Heisman Trophy finalist, and I think if I don't know exactly how the roster is going to look, but you got to think it's going to be good with whatever quarterbacks in Tuscaloosa.
100%. We're going to bring on now John Talty, senior writer at 247 Sports. And he's been doing a lot of work here, just trying to follow the hiring process of how Alabama ultimately landed on Kalen DeBoer. He's been updating our Bama 247 board daily, multiple times, just with different updates and what he's hearing. John, we're still kind of doing a quick little instant reaction to, Alabama hiring Kalen DeBoer. What was kind of your initial reaction when you heard that was going to be the guy?
Yeah, I think it's been kind of trending this way. I think he was, if I think back to the initial, once we got past the initial shock of Nick Saban retiring, I would say he was one of the first names that I heard. I think we posted, I think it was Thursday morning, I posted something about how an industry source who I trusted told me it would be either DeBoer or Dan Lanning. And, so it was a name that I think we've been kind of trending toward. There are other names, of course, that we reported on and mentioned. Mike Norvell at Florida State was one of them, Sark at Texas. But DeBoer was a constant. He was, quiet the whole way through when there was more talk around other guys, which kind of led me to think, all right, there's something happening here, especially knowing the way that Greg Byrne likes to conduct things. He was a Jimmy Sexton client. I think we expected it to be a Sexton client who ultimately got hired. So I'm not shocked by it. And I think especially once we saw the field kind of clear out, it felt like it was only DeBoer left, really. I don't really know who was going to be next if it wasn't him. And some of it was just trying to make sure that the money was right. I reported something earlier today. He had a $9 million annual offer on the table from Washington. Bama, from my understanding, is going to beat that. But that's a lot of money. And so that was more than doubling his salary. So Washington was doing all they could to keep him. And I think it just took some time to get it to a point where the numbers made sense for him to leave Washington for Alabama.
Yeah, a lot of details that are going to continue to come out just about the process of him, Washington fighting to keep him, Alabama obviously making their offer and their pitch. We'll learn more about that in the coming days. I'm sure we'll have an intro press conference before too much longer. But John, I'm curious too, from a pure football fit, what do you think when Brett and I were talking earlier, when we think Kalen DeBoer, we think winner, we think offense. What's the first maybe thing that comes to mind in terms of a football fit at Alabama? What's the Tide getting?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. This is a guy who's had a meteoric rise over the last few years. It's what's interesting, and I think it was Matt Hinton who made this point on Twitter today. He was a good follow. That for probably the decade that I've been in Alabama, there's been this constant question of who's going to replace Saban. And even a week ago, this guy's name was not going to be on anyone's guess. So it's interesting. He's, I think, in some ways still very anonymous within the world. I think if you're a college football fan, of course, you saw what Washington did this year. But before that, unless you're a real football hardo, I don't think you knew much about him. I briefly met him this past year. He was just kind of a regular guy. I mean, it wasn't like I thought a star walked in. I was like, oh, hey, nice to meet you. I shook his hand, said my name, and we talked for a second. That was kind of it. And he's kind of been that guy. He's been, I've heard he's very low ego, very low key, regular guy, was able to live his life that way. I'm fascinated to see how he handles being in the fishbowl of Tuscaloosa and being one of the most famous people from day one in Alabama. And I think that's kind of when we get past just the football side of things, which you guys can talk more about. I'm interested in just the fit standpoint of not a guy who's been around. Washington's a great program, but it's not Alabama in terms of the interest and the pressure and the support and all these different things. It's going to be a lot of people are going to talk about how he hasn't coached in the South. I know that some people say a winner's win, and I agree, but Brian Harsin won a lot of games at Boise State before he came to Auburn. And one of the biggest mistakes Harsin made was that he thought what he did there automatically translated. And it doesn't always. I think you need to have smart people. I think, especially in the recruiting and personnel departments. And Brett, this is your area, but he's got to have people who know the landscape. It is different recruiting in the SEC than everywhere else. There are just certain things that you need to know how to do. I don't want to go too much more into it, but you just have, it's a different game than it is at Washington or Fresno State or Indiana. So he's got to have smart people around him to help navigate that. Alabama, from an NIL situation, has benefited a lot from having Nick Saban. He's going to have to get out there and talk to boosters and get some more money rolling in if they're going to be competitive. So I'm not trying to be negative, but I'm just immediately thinking, here are some of the things that I think he's going to have to figure out sooner than later. But just from a big picture standpoint, he's won a lot. I mean, he was in the national championship game. What was it, Monday? I mean, it feels like it was a month ago, but literally this week. So that's kind of crazy. He did a great job with Michael Penix. And I think that's what you need to sell to Jalen Milroe. That's what you need to sell to Julian Sayin. That's what you need to sell to other QBs that you're going to be recruiting. Like, hey, I'm an offensive guru. We're going to have a really fun offense here. Ryan Williams, Isaiah Bond, like, let's get back on board and let's do this. And then, just try to recruit and hire a good staff, hire a defensive coordinator that fits. There's already some names I've heard thrown out there that are going to be important for him to try to get one of them.
Yeah, I think there's of the other things that maybe come to mind when it comes to Kalen DeBoer and just the success that he had at Washington. We all know about Michael Penix. We all know about Roma Dunze. We all know about how just that offense really, and really the quarterback and the receivers, all those guys are probably going to be playing on Sundays sooner rather than later. Now you're coming to a place like Alabama that has a lot more talent than Washington. No disrespect to Washington. They got to the national championship game, but if you go back and look at, I know the 247 Sports team talent composite isn't everything. I think there's a lot about it that's maybe an inexact science, but it is kind of a decent indicator of what kind of talent he's working with. Washington, I believe, was 26th this past year. Alabama was obviously number one. You look at some of the past recruiting team rankings since DeBoer has been at Washington, that kind of hovered around the low to mid 20s, whereas like Alabama, obviously number one, number two, continuously year in and year out. This is a guy that has done a lot with less, and now he's going to have a lot in terms of just overall talent. And I think that's, combine that just with the fact that he has a track record of winning and adjusting and, finding ways to do a lot with maybe a talent deficit, so to speak. I think there's a lot to be excited about here if we want to, stay optimistic and, what is this guy going to bring here? I think he's going to bring a lot of really good ideas to a very talented roster. Now, roster management, I think, is part of his to-do list, right? Like that's probably going to be at the top of the to-do list, who's going to stay, who's going to go. He just got done recruiting a bunch of guys to Washington. I believe there were guys who were taking visits to Washington this weekend that heard, that he was on his way to Alabama now. What's that going to look like? What is the crossover going to look like? What's it going to, what's the spring going to look like, right? There's a transfer window at the end of spring too, in addition to the current 30-day window for both Alabama and Washington players. So I'm super fascinated to kind of see what that looks like too. But I don't think it's a stretch to say that he's going to have a lot more talent than maybe he's used to having at some of his previous head coaching spots. And that's a very intriguing thought considering how good he's already been. I'll throw that out to either of you too.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on it right there. And, you mentioned, the recruiting class rankings and the team composite rankings, talking with, again, 247 national guys, Greg Biggins, Brandon Huffman. Brandon Huffman's out west. Greg Biggins is as well. Very close with that Washington program. Not going to get too much into the details. You can go ahead and read that on Bama 247. And if you're not a VIP subscriber, hop on today, get 60% off for the next, I believe it's the next couple weeks. Washington was a little bit different. You said it exactly right. He did a lot more with less. And they talked to me a little bit about how their NIL was set up there. And in each program, NIL set up a little bit differently. But the way, I was talked to and told, it seemed like there was a little bit more stock maybe put in the current players in the program and the current guys, in the portal, maybe not as much money or effort being put into the high school level. And it's to John's point too, you come over, you do more than less, and you've got so many things around you. I mean, you got Nick Saban with an office in Bryant-Denny Stadium, and it's just going to be, priority number one is retaining the roster and then getting guys on your coaching staff that have been in and around the SEC ranks in the recruiting space. Immediate guys that come to Ryan, or, Travaris Robinson is up for contract. We'll see what happens there. But yeah, and it's what Nick Saban has set up there to be successful for years and years as far as a recruiting standpoint goes, film and how to do this and how to recruit this way and vice versa. I think it's going to be extremely important how Kalen DeBoer adapts to that. I don't know if adapts the right word, if he maybe, completely overhauls it or says, hey, this thing has worked and it's been a machine for 17 years. I'll adapt to that. So it's going to be very interesting to see how he kind of goes about that aspect.
No, I completely agree. And I think it's both an internal and external thing. We've been part of this Sabanized way of doing things with the process, and we're all kind of used to it. Fans are used to it. People in that building are used to it. So there's going to be a change no matter what. Kalen DeBoer is not Nick Saban in many ways, but I do think it would be smart to not completely burn it all down, right? I mean, there's Nick Saban is the godfather of the personnel boom departments and all the recruiting departments. I mean, he has had a massive impact in that world, and he has set up a good system there. Now, of course, you're going to want to bring in some of your own people. I think it's important to do that, but there's a lot of really talented people at Alabama still. And so molding that, I think, is going to be important for him, finding guys that know how you do things and can help explain to people at Alabama how Kalen wants to do it. That's critically important. But also having people at Alabama who have been there a while who can tell you, all right, here are the potential landmines to avoid. Here's the people you need to know. Just having those guys, I think will be really important. I'm curious to see, just who he retains, who he doesn't. One guy I think will be interesting to see if he can bring him with him is Ryan Grubb, who, of course, Nick Saban tried to hire a year ago. I've heard some different things that have led me to believe that there is a realistic chance of that happening, especially if he doesn't get the Washington job. Had heard from someone yesterday that they believed he would go with Kalen if Kalen ended up taking the Alabama job. So we'll see what happens there. But if that's the case, that immediately gets you excited. The last offensive coordinator that Nick Saban tried to hire, also coming with Kalen DeBoer, I think is a great fit. And then if you hire a good defensive coordinator, you're cooking right there. And you kind of add some other recruiters, and I think you're in a good spot. So, I think, again, when you surveyed the market and you looked at who was a possibility, there are a couple names that we all thought. And, there's some that I think if they could have gotten would have been great. Sark being probably the one that I felt the most about. But DeBoer was one of the top options available, and I think he says a lot about him that he is willing to come in after Nick Saban and try to, keep something going that has been unprecedented and replace a guy who you're going to be compared to every single day. And that's tough. I mean, that takes a real confidence to be able to walk into that situation. And so we'll see how he handles it. But just even taking the job, I think does say a lot about him.
Yeah, John, real quick, I don't want you to, give up too much here, but, you've covered the beat for 10 years and it's always been, who's going to replace Nick Saban when it's all said and done. And like you said right there, who wants to replace Nick Saban? It's the greatest coaching job available. And it's also at the same time, it's you're getting compared to Nick Saban. Do you think, like, in conversations that maybe coaches kind of shied away from that more than you thought, if that makes sense?
I did hear that today, and it's hard to quantify it. I do think that, generally speaking, that it's a combination of factors, but I do think it plays a role. I do. Yeah. I think that certain people, if you're thinking, I'm in a good position, I'm doing well, and I don't have to be compared to that guy every day. Now, I think the jump from Washington to Alabama, again, no knock on Washington, it's a great program, but that's a pretty clear jump. But I think, and again, I don't know all of, say, Sark's thinking, but hypothetically, and talking to some people around him, you're in a really good spot at Texas. Things are rolling, all those things. Plus, do you want to replace Saban, right? So I do think it's a factor for people. I think that just also looking at the coaching market, like, there just weren't a lot of obvious names, in my opinion, beyond 5 or 6 guys that you're like, all right, he might have combination of resume, personality, all these different things to possibly fit it. A lot of the guys that we thought could have been it over the years, a lot of them have faded, whether it's Mario Cristobal, Billy Napier. Those are 2 guys 3 years ago you thought might have a shot. Dabo, Lane Kiffin, a lot of those guys have either faded or fallen off for various reasons. And then guys like Sark and Kirby were just too entrenched. They have too good of a thing going to make sense to want to jump and leave that to come to Alabama. But I got to jump off here. Great talking to you guys. Keep doing the good work, and maybe I'll pop back in a little bit.
No, you're good. I appreciate you taking the time to come chat with us. Yeah, there's a lot of different branches off of this tree that we'll probably pick at over the next, few days. Definitely after we hear from DeBoer for the first time during his intro press conference, which I don't believe has been announced yet, but I imagine it'll be sometime within the next week. A lot of interesting discussion to be had. And one of the things that I was, that I wanted to mention there that I thought was, just the idea that this was the guy that ended up, wanting to be the guy that followed Saban. I think there's something to the idea of, embracing that challenge. And this is a guy that, not to make too much of it, but like, there's a very distinct difference between an FCS program and an FBS program. And there is a mountain of a difference between those 2 levels of football and NAIA football. And the fact that this guy was able to find a lot of success very quickly, very immediately at that level. And now, once he was able to find all that success, he was able to jump to the next level and then continue to find success at literally everywhere he went. I mean, even as an offensive coordinator, I thought this was super interesting as well. When he was at Indiana, he was only at Indiana for a year. And I'm sure there's a story there about how, him and Michael Penix ultimately met up, and then they obviously met back up at Washington and had the last 2 seasons that they've had. But, the year before he got to Indiana, it had been more than a decade, I guess, since Indiana had, produced a winning season. And with DeBoer there 1 year running a pro style offense, they ranked 15th nationally in passing offense. They averaged 32 points a game, over 430 yards of total offense per game. Hoosiers went 8-5, their first winning season since, I believe, 2007. He also had coaching stops as offensive coordinator at Eastern Michigan. The year before he showed up, they ranked 111th in total offense. A few years later, they had climbed to number 35 overall. He had the same stop at Fresno State. He was a head coach there, but before there, he spent 2 years as the OC. The year before he showed up, Fresno State ranked 120th in total offense. His first year there, they jumped to 72nd. His next year there, they jumped into the top 50. Like, this is a guy that runs towards challenges like that. And not only does he run toward and embrace the challenge, but more often than not, he comes out on top. And so I can't think of a bigger challenge than trying to step in after Nick Saban. And I think I think that says a lot about him. But then two, the other thing that also comes to mind, Nick Saban's not going anywhere. That was something that we learned this week in his various interviews after he officially announced his retirement, is that he's going to have an office, I believe, at Bryant-Denny. He's going to be around. He's going to be in the community. He wants to support the program in whatever way he can. I'll be very interested to see that dynamic, because I think Kalen DeBoer is a smart guy, right? He's going to find a way to leverage a good working relationship with Nick Saban, not only to kind of figure out, the lay of the land and learn the ropes and, try to establish his own thing there, but also, like, you got the greatest college football coach of all time right down the road. Like, wouldn't you call him if you had a question, right? Like, not just on or off the field, but just, even if it's like little day-to-day stuff, like, I'd be very curious to kind of see how DeBoer utilizes the fact that Saban is not going anywhere, and it doesn't, we'll learn more when we talk to him, obviously, but there are a lot of people that would be intimidated by the fact that Saban is going to be there and he's going to be right down the road, and you're the next guy coming in after him and you're going to be in his shadow. And like John said, you're going to be compared to him at virtually, almost after every game, probably, like even probably in the middle of games when you're making mid-game decisions. Be very curious to see, how he embraces that, how he's able to kind of utilize and leverage that relationship with Saban to, make his own mark here, for however long he's here.
Yeah, absolutely. You said it right there. He's going to be kind of judged based off Nick Saban virtually at every game. I would go as far to
so
say
not fair, but like, it's coming.
I would go as far to say is Kalen DeBoer better make sure he's got a Mercedes already lined up. Just he's gonna get judged on everything. But I've talking with some people around the industry and some friends just throughout the last couple of days, and you brought up a good point. It's going to be very interesting to see how Kalen DeBoer, I wouldn't say welcomes Nick Saban, because like Nick Saban's kind of welcoming him. I mean, on one side of it is like you said, you've got the greatest college football coach at all time at your disposal on campus, still with you. But on the other side of it is just devil advocate here is, maybe Kalen DeBoer starts saying, whose program is it, type of thing. And I'm not saying it's going to get to that point, at all. I have no reason to say that, but I'm just saying there's so many things that are going to be very interesting to see how they play out in the next 48, 72, week in the next 2 weeks or whatever, however long it may be. But, I brought up, you talked about Michael Penix for a second, and I was doing a couple stories about what past recruits or things that people have said about Kalen DeBoer in the past. And, I've got a quote here from, this was when Michael Penix decided to transfer to Washington. He said, "Going Indiana helped me meet Coach DeBoer, and a relationship that we built throughout the years has been amazing. I wouldn't want to play for anybody else, so I'm super blessed." So that just kind of shows the relationship they formed, maybe, kind of shows the kind of person Caleb DeBoer is, and talking a little bit more with the national guys, kind of learning more about the recruiting and development standpoint. They all three guys I talked to from the national team kind of talked about how he is, family. He's got, a different way of recruiting maybe than Nick Saban does. Most fans, I don't know this, but assistant coaches were kind of broken up by region in the country for recruiting wise. And I was told Caleb DeBoer does it kind of multiple assistant coaches on each recruit. Doesn't matter where, you are in the country. So, if a coach gets fired or, something happens, you still got that constant communication. So again, I kind of keep coming back to the same point, but we're going to see how it all plays out very quickly. It's going to be very interesting to see if, Caleb DeBoer says, this is my recruiting department. This is, my program. Well, it is his program. Sorry about it. But, it's going to be very interesting how he handles that dynamic.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of interesting things that we're going to keep track of. And, learn more about in the days, weeks, and months ahead. I feel like, spring ball is going to be here before we know it. There's still another, 28 days of free flowing open transfer portal stuff that we're going to have to see between Alabama's roster and Washington's roster. So we'll be sure to keep track of those things. And at some point we're going to meet the guy. At some point he's going to show up here in Tuscaloosa. There's probably going to be a lot of fan excitement at the Tuscaloosa airport, if not Birmingham. And, he's going to have to move his family across the country. A fun little thing I thought was really cool about this, I guess his oldest daughter, Alexis, is a very, very talented softball player. So
that got me excited.
Yeah, well, right. Like you covered, Alabama softball. That was one of the first things I wrote about when I got hired here last June. Like there's, is she going to come with him to play for Alabama? I think Patrick Murphy would probably be pretty happy about that if that's ultimately what happened.
It was pretty interesting. I thought on Twitter, I think it was Brandon Marcello or someone over on 247 kind of brought up, found a quote. It was like from Kalen saying, my daughter, I can walk 100 feet and go watch my daughter practice. Like it's nothing better in the world. So I would think maybe she's going to transfer over here. Maybe Byrne put it in the call to, old Coach Murph and said, you've got a new player on your roster type of thing. I'm not sure at all. But looking at her, she seems to be super talented. So that was pretty exciting. It's just kind of neat how it's kind of a small world, even in college football. And I think it was, you may know better than me, I think Mike sent it over. It's like Jim McElwain's son, who's the old offense coordinator at Alabama, is somewhere high in the personnel department with Kalen DeBoer. So it always what goes around comes around. It's just kind of a small circle. It's certainly very interesting.
100%. We've got a lot of time to dive into all of that over the next, like I said, days, weeks, months ahead. Guy hadn't even gotten to Tuscaloosa yet, and here we are with the instant reaction pod. We'll definitely have more of that as we go forward. We appreciate you guys tuning in to listen to us today. Not sure exactly when we'll be back. We might be back before the intro press conference. We might also be back immediately after the intro press conference, whether that's sometime this weekend or maybe early next week. We'll obviously keep you guys up to date at Bama247.com. In the meantime, though, please be sure to rate and review the show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama247 and 247 Sports. We are running a special. I feel like we're always running a special, but now we are absolutely running a new coach special, 60% off an annual VIP membership for the entire year. I believe it comes out to about $43 for the entire year. Should absolutely take advantage of that, especially if you are a diehard Alabama fan. We're going to be having loads of intel and content and stories and thoughts and opinions and analysis about Kalen DeBoer hire, what it means for Alabama, what it means for Washington, and everything in between. So be sure to sign up. Thank you, Brett, for jumping on to instantly react to Alabama's new head football coach. Still a weird thing to say, but we're going to have to get used to it now. Kalen DeBoer is the new guy in Tuscaloosa. We appreciate you guys always as listening. We will talk to you all again soon.